The golden age of cinema was built on a foundation of carefully constructed illusions. The perfect smiles, the glamorous lifestyles, the legendary names glowing on theater marquees, nearly all of it was a manufactured reality. Behind the scenes, many of the era's biggest icons were compelled to erase their true identities just to walk through the studio gates. Born into immigrant families and Yiddish-speaking households, these Jewish performers carried names that Hollywood executives decided were too ethnic to sell to mainstream America. So they traded their heritage for stardom. Here are 11 Jewish stars who changed their names for Hollywood, along with the poignant secrets they left behind in the process. Tony Curtis's journey began as Bernard Schwartz in the Bronx, born to Hungarian Jewish immigrants who had very little protection to offer him. His early years were defined not just by financial struggle, but by genuine trauma. A brother who passed away too young, a mother battling severe mental illness, and streets that were as dangerous as they were educational. The boy who would eventually become one of the most photographed faces in the industry grew up in a world that offered him almost no advantages. When he stepped into entertainment, the pressure to drop his ethnic identity was immediate. Bernard Schwartz didn't fit the marquee. Tony Curtis did. The change was practical and professional, though he later admitted it was deeply painful in ways he couldn't fully grasp at the time. Curtis rose fast. His looks were undeniable, and studios crafted a polished image around them. But he was more than just a handsome face. Films like Some Like It Hot, The Defiant Ones, and Sweet Smell of Success proved he was willing to take risks and play against type. Off-screen, however, he struggled with the distance his reinvention created. He spoke later about the strange grief of trading one identity for another before you're old enough to understand the cost. Jerry Lewis, he was born Joseph Levitch in Newark, New Jersey, to Jewish parents who worked the Borscht Belt circuit as entertainers. For him, show business wasn't a dream. It was simply life. His father was a comedian, his mother a pianist, and the family moved constantly to follow bookings. Young Joseph absorbed the mechanics of performance before he could even form full sentences. The shift from Joseph Levitch to Jerry Lewis looked like a simple industry adjustment on the surface, but it reflected a deeper reality. The entertainment world was warming to Jewish humor, but only if it came in assimilated packaging. Jerry Lewis was accessible. Joseph Levitch carried too much history in too many syllables. Under the new name, Hollywood got something it hadn't bargained for: an anarchic, boundary-pushing physical comedian. His partnership with Dean Martin created some of the 1950s most beloved comedies, while his solo work revealed ambitions far beyond the laugh track. In France, he was revered as a serious filmmaker, though American critics were slower to catch on. Lewis remained complicated about his identity, proud of his background, but shaped by the hunger of a child raised in instability, always chasing the next laugh. Lauren Bacall arrived in New York City as Betty Joan Persky, carrying a name rooted in her family's Jewish heritage and Eastern European origins. Raised mostly by her mother after her parents separated, she grew up in a modest home where ambition was a necessity, not a luxury. She understood early that the world wouldn't hand her anything, she would have to take it. The name change was part of the studio machinery that shaped nearly every actress of her time. Betty Persky didn't fit the image being built. Lauren Bacall did. The transformation was strategic and deliberate. What wasn't expected was the woman who emerged beneath it. Bacall's screen presence was electric. Her voice was low, her gaze direct, her confidence unshakable. When she appeared opposite Humphrey Bogart in To Have and Have Not, audiences felt the arrival of a new kind of woman, one who didn't apologize or soften herself. Behind that presence was a woman who carried her identity carefully. Her Jewish heritage was rarely discussed publicly, but those who knew her understood it, shaped her directness and her refusal to perform weakness. Kirk Douglas. He was born Ishur Danielovich Dembski to poor Jewish immigrants from Belarus, carrying a name as rooted in the old world as the village his parents had fled. His father, a ragman, raised him in poverty in Amsterdam, New York, where young Ishur grew up knowing hunger and the weight of being visibly different. When he arrived in Hollywood, the industry made one thing clear. The name had to go. Ishur Danielovich Dembski was not a name that would sell tickets. So he became Kirk Douglas, sharp, strong, and unmistakably American. The new name opened doors the old one never could, but the cost was something quieter and harder to measure. Douglas built his career on intensity, performances in Spartacus, Paths of Glory, and Champion were defined by a raw energy that was impossible to ignore. Behind that screen presence was a man who had been fighting his entire life, first against poverty, then against an industry that wanted to shape him, and finally against the political darkness of the blacklist era. His decision to publicly credit Dalton Trumbo on Spartacus was one of the most courageous acts in Hollywood history. It was also the act of a man reclaiming an identity. Danny Kaye, born David Daniel Kaminsky in Brooklyn to Ukrainian Jewish immigrants, he grew up in a household where humor was survival. His father was a tailor, his mother worked hard, and the neighborhood was alive with the energy of families trying to build something from nothing. David Kaminsky absorbed it all and turned it into something unique. The name change to Danny Kaye was less about erasure and more about invention. He was building a stage persona, fast, elastic, electric, and the new name was part of that construction. What couldn't be constructed was the talent. That was entirely his own. Kaye's physical comedy, his mastery of rapid-fire routines, and his ability to shift between languages and characters within a single performance were products of years of hard work. By the time he reached Hollywood, he had developed a style so singular studios didn't know where to put him. He was a comedian, singer, actor, and physical performer all at once. Films like The Secret Life of Walter Mitty and Hans Christian Andersen showed extraordinary range. But what distinguished Kaye beyond talent was his character. His work as a UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador showed compassion that was, by all accounts, entirely genuine. Edward G. Robinson, he was born Emanuel Goldenberg in Bucharest, Romania. Arriving in America as a Jewish immigrant child in a country still learning how to include people like him. The journey from Emanuel Goldenberg to Edward G. Robinson was not a straight line. It was a negotiation with an industry, a country, and himself. The name change was one of the most complete reinventions in Hollywood history. Emanuel Goldenberg disappeared, replaced by a name that sounded like it belonged to a senator. But what could not be changed was the intensity behind his eyes. Robinson became famous playing gangsters, hard men with short fuses. Little Caesar made him a star and fixed him in the public imagination as a figure of danger. The irony was not lost on those who knew him. Off-screen, Robinson was one of the most cultured and gentle men in Hollywood. He collected fine art and read widely. He was the opposite of every character he played. His Jewish identity remained important to him throughout his life, even as it was rarely acknowledged publicly. When the McCarthy-era blacklist reached him, the experience carried the familiar weight of being targeted for who you are. Gene Wilder. Born Jerome Silverman in Milwaukee to a Jewish family, he chose his stage name with the quiet intentionality that defined everything he did. Jerome Silverman was a name that belonged to a specific world, a Jewish household, and a childhood shaped by his mother's illness. Gene Wilder was the name he carried into the world he was building, softer, more open. Somehow both more vulnerable and more free. Unlike many name changes of the Golden Age, Wilder's was not forced on him by a studio. It was his own decision, reflecting his belief that a performer needed a name that fit the characters he wanted to play. And the characters he wanted to play were not tough men. They were dreamers, eccentrics, souls floating slightly above the ground. His performances in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, Young Frankenstein, and Blazing Saddles revealed an actor with a singular approach. There was a gentleness in his work that was rare, and a sadness beneath the comedy that gave everything he did lasting weight. His Jewish heritage informed his sensibility in ways that were rarely explicit, but always present. Working with Mel Brooks, Wilder found a creative partnership that produced some of the most enduring comedies of the 20th century. Shelley Winters, born Shirley Shrift in St. Louis to a Jewish family, she understood from an early age that the world she wanted to enter had specific ideas about who belonged in it. Shirley Shrift was not a Hollywood name. Shelley Winters was. The transformation was swift, the calculation clear, and the woman who emerged was anything but what the industry had planned. Winters was not content to be decorative. She pushed into roles that were dark, complex, and emotionally demanding. Her performances in A Place in the Sun and The Diary of Anne Frank, for which she won an Academy Award, demonstrated a depth that silenced any doubt about her abilities. The role in The Diary of Anne Frank carried a particular weight. Winters played Petronella Van Daan, one of the Jewish families hiding in the annex. The performance was personal in ways that went beyond preparation. She knew what that story meant. She understood it not just as history, but as inheritance. It was the kind of understanding that comes from being the grandchild of the world that produced it. John Garfield, born Jacob Julius Garfinkel in the Bronx to a Jewish family, he grew up in circumstances that shaped his screen persona more directly than almost any other actor of his era. Raised in poverty following his mother's early death, he spent time in reform school and navigated some of the toughest streets New York had to offer. The young man who emerged from those years carried something no acting school could teach, a real understanding of what it felt like to be on the wrong side of the system. When he arrived in Hollywood, Jacob Garfinkel became John Garfield, a name with enough neutrality to satisfy the industry while retaining a hint of street-level toughness. And those roles were unlike most of what Hollywood was producing. Garfield played outsiders, working-class men, characters who pushed back against a world rigged against them. Films like Body and Soul, Force of Evil, and The Postman Always Rings Twice gave him a screen presence that felt genuinely dangerous because it was genuinely true. His politics matched his screen persona. When the McCarthy era arrived, he was targeted aggressively. He refused to name names. The pressure was relentless. His career was dismantled and his health deteriorated. He died in 1952 at the age of 39. Those who knew him understood that something deeper had been broken long before the end. Paul Muni. Born Meshulam Meyer Wiesenfried in Lemberg in what is now Ukraine, he carried one of the most distinctly Jewish names in Hollywood history. A name so thoroughly rooted in the Ashkenazi world that the industry's demand for its replacement was almost inevitable. His parents were performers in the Yiddish theater, and young Meshulam grew up backstage, surrounded by performance and the emotional depth of a theatrical tradition that had endured centuries of hardship. When he arrived in Hollywood, he became Paul Muni, a name that was professional, neutral, and sufficiently detached from his origins. But the actor who emerged under that name was anything but neutral. Muni was ferocious in his commitment to his roles. He did not merely perform characters, he inhabited them physically and emotionally. Films like Scarface, I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang, and The Story of Louis Pasteur demonstrated a range that was extraordinary. Critics frequently noted that Muni seemed to disappear into his roles entirely. Given his history, there was perhaps something more than craft at work. A man who had been asked to erase his name might find a particular freedom in erasing himself entirely for art. Jeff Chandler, born Ira Grossel in Brooklyn to a Jewish family, he took one of the more complete transformations of his era, trading a name rooted in his immigrant heritage for one that sounded as though it had been carved directly out of the American West. Chandler became one of Hollywood's most recognizable action and Western heroes. His imposing frame and prematurely silver hair making him a natural fit for the rugged roles that defined his career. The distance between Ira Grossel and Jeff Chandler was not just a matter of syllables. It was a complete reimagining of identity. Chandler's most celebrated role was as Cochise, the Apache chief in Broken Arrow, a performance that earned him an Academy Award nomination. The particular irony of a Jewish man from Brooklyn playing a Native American chief was rarely discussed at the time. It is perhaps one of the more striking examples of Hollywood's complicated relationship with identity. Off-screen, Chandler maintained a quiet connection to his Jewish background, even as his screen image pointed in an entirely different direction. He died young in 1961 at the age of 42, cutting short a career that had only just begun to reveal its full range. These 11 Jewish stars who changed their names for Hollywood left behind a legacy that is about more than just fame.